Arches, or like I like to call it, Arches watercolor paper has long been considered the king of all watercolor paper. It's mold made, 100% cotton, richly textured, perfectly sized, and that all poises it to support all of the magic that is watercolor. But there is a serious contender at a much lower price. Yep, that's right. So today I'm comparing Arches paper to Legion Stonehenge, both cold press, and I want to see if the added cost of Arches is truly worth it. Let's get to it. Just to give you a preview, I'm conducting a few experiments. I'm using the ombre technique, flooding, lifting, scrubbing, and just give an idea of the general feel underhand as I paint. And then we're gonna wrap up with a true side-by-side painting to see how each of these really perform. Each of these are in a block presentation. A true block is where 3 out of 4 sides are glued down to themselves, basically, and you have to kind of separate the sheets with a butter knife or some type of tool in that little space that's unglued. I love blocks. It keeps your paper more flat as you work. They're just fantastic. The first thing you're going to notice on the right is Arches, and this is definitely more textured. They are known for having a rougher texture when it comes to cold press, comparatively speaking, when you look at different papers across the market. Today, I'm going to be using 2 different palettes. I'm using my M-Gram watercolor palette and then also my own Art for Joy's Sake palette. M-Gram watercolors are super sheer and tons of clarity, whereas my watercolor set leans a little more opaque in some of the color formulations. So I wanted you to get a look at how this paper handles both types of watercolor personality. Starting out here on the left with the Legion Stonehenge, and I'm just gonna start adding some color onto the damp page and then bump up other colors next to it just to see how it feels. And immediately I'm noticing that the Stonehenge really responds beautifully to wet and wet. It does exactly what you would actually expect a more expensive paper to do, like Arches. It really takes that color and lets it flow. And I can already feel underhand that it feels very much like my beloved Arches that I've been using since I was like 11 years old. So that is very promising to me, a little bit harder maybe for you to see on screen, but the feel underhand is so important, and the way that the paper responds to the touch of the paintbrush is so important. And so far, the feel is very similar to the more expensive Arches. Going over here again to the Arches, and I'm sorry that I pronounce it that way, but you're just gonna have to stick with me. You don't have to, but I hope you do. Anyway, you know what? Let's get into comments. Let me know, have you always pronounced it the way that I do, or have you pronounced it the correct way? I wanna see who else is like me. All right, getting back to Arches and seeing this ombre. I will say this is just a peculiarity of my personal kind of affinity, but I love more textured watercolor paper. I love the way that the paint sits on the paper. So I'm definitely a little bit more drawn to that effect, the Arches effect on the right. That's not necessarily a statement of quality though, so I'm gonna try to, keep my opinions at bay on that one. Let's go into just making a wet on dry shape. I'm gonna kind of work together a little blueberry situation here. This is gonna give me an opportunity to do some flooding like I am doing right now, just really adding some water and flooding around the water so it pushes into the pigment I laid down before. Now we're putting in the top of this blueberry, and that's giving us wet on wet moments, just dabbing in. I love the feel of the Stonehenge underhand. It is doing everything that I would expect a paper to do, quality watercolor paper to do. Now over on Arches, again, this is just the difference that I'm feeling here is really in regards to the texture. And that for me, I'm just a little bit more of a texture gal. So I will say this. If you actually find Arches or rough watercolor paper to be annoying, or it's just not your thing, you're definitely going to probably enjoy Stonehenge a little bit more, because while it is textured, it's definitely smoother. Let's head on over to the left and just do a little push and shove and lifting, and just see how the paper reacts. This is lifting beautifully. This is the Stonehenge. lifting effortlessly. And I will say this blue is a little bit more of a staining color from my palette. And so it is really responding well to this paper. The paper is staying wet. I'm about, I don't know, 6 minutes in, and even my top row on Stonehenge is still very damp, which is exactly what I would expect. I will say this, look at the arches. I tried very, very specifically to use the same kind of load of paint on my brush, and I feel like the arches, I don't know how to describe it. It took in the paint and used it more effectively somehow. And you can head into comments if you're like, wait, what are you saying? Because I probably could have described that better, but I do feel like the arches, using the same amount of paint as I did on Stonehenge, just kind of utilize the paint better and spread a little bit better. And so that could just be, just full disclosure, me using a little bit more blue paint, even though I tried not to. And the lifting, spectacular. This is where arches will shine. You can push and nudge and bully this paper till the end of your days, and it will always bounce back. It will always hold up. And that's one of the things that makes it pretty spectacular. Something I want to look at as well. Are there weird textural things happening as the paint dries? That could indicate kind of a inconsistent sizing. There are a lot of papers out there that do have that problem. Strathmere 400 series is one of them. So I don't think we're gonna see any of that here, friends, but just something to keep an eye on when we're testing. All right, now going into a dry brush technique, I'm just doing some press, drag, and lift motions here, and I want to just use a brush full of paint but not so full of water, and see how this looks on the page. Now as I paint, friends, I am certainly making my predictions. I am letting you know my thoughts on how these two papers are functioning comparatively speaking, but you got to wait till the end because I'm going to give you my overall thoughts, and I think you're going to be pretty surprised. So look at this, same amount of moisture and paint on my brush on the Stonehenge, and it is giving me a smoother feel overall, easier. It's a rougher texture paper, and it's 100% cotton, and it's all the things that are glorious about watercolor paper, but it requires more water on your brush to do the magic. So Stonehenge doesn't soak up as much water, and so it's a little easier in terms of blending those first strokes that you lay down on the page. My prediction here as I was painting is that Stonehenge is going to be great for wet on wet, loose watercolor, but potentially not as great for glazing and layers of detail, but we shall see. All right, friends, this is my scrubbing test, and this is basically me getting into a fist fight with the page. And I'm doing this on purpose. I'm using a medium to heavy pressure. You can kind of see the beating that my bristles are taking, and I'm doing this for, I'm estimating about a minute. You don't need to sit through the minute, but this is holding up well. Initially, I saw some of the paper texture start to kind of lift up, and it concerned me, but it seemed to settle down as I added more water to the paper. And so overall, this paper takes a beating with that first layer of that one color layer of water and color on the page. So, and of course, I can tell you right now, arches, I've said it before, you can just bully her until the cows come home, and she ain't gonna fight back. She's spectacular when it comes to beginners. Beginners might be more heavy-handed and abuse the paper more. So really, really fantastic at taking a beating. All right, I wanted to paint a little bit more of a scene to get a sense of how it was going to let me develop layers, how each paper was going to let me do that. And so I've got a little tulip action going here, getting those first layers down, doing as I do with my own approach to first layers. I'm always adding a lot of color, color next to color. I will do wet on wet to fill in spaces. And I'm immediately noticing with the Stonehenge that as I start lifting and layering and adding some opaque paint personality on top of the sheer, it's starting to look a little muddy, especially down there in the bottom right hand, that little upside down V-shaped leaf there that's going out to the right. Do you see that muddiness? And that's from me kind of mixing and blending different watercolor textures together and removing some of the paint and adding more paint. I'm just feeling like the layering capabilities on this paper might be limited. All right, skipping ahead, painting the same or similar tulip as on the Stonehenge. And you can notice already the way that the paint is sitting on the page, the way that the page is kind of taking the paint, it's spreading it out, it's allowing it to move and groove, but still maintaining a sheerness, especially as I start to manipulate and scrub and blend and lift within that green leaf. It was at this point with the tulip that I realized pretty strongly that layering and glazing and just getting into the painting, wet on wet, wet on damp, layer after layer, was probably going to be an issue for Stonehenge. And honestly, I've used this paper for years, but in the span of time that I used Stonehenge heavily, I was not into layering and glazing. I was doing a lot of bold, instinctive, one layer, modern watercolor type of compositions. And I've kind of evolved since then. I need to do another comparison. So let's get into it. And I'm really going to push this. I'm really going to push the layering on both Arches and Stonehenge because I need to know once and for all. All right, this time around, friends, I'm going to paint side by side, split screen, and you can see what's going on. You can see I'm doing my best here to use very similar types of brush strokes, colors. I'm following up at the end layer with watercolor markers, really trying to just push this experiment. We're gonna find out if Stonehenge is gonna hold up to multiple layers, even just 2 layers, as well as we've seen Arches. Okay, friends, I've got these 2 paintings kind of at a very similar spot, but I wanted to mention one thing that I think is good to know. So these are watercolor blocks, and you do have to kind of slice off the pages along those 3 glued sides. I noticed that the Stonehenge paper is a lot softer, and it doesn't kind of cut off as easily. And I made little tears and nicks in the paper by kind of working through that motion the very same way I do with my Arches block, but it required a much lighter touch, and I'm even thinking a different tool altogether to get a nice clean tear off the block. So just something to be aware of, because the most catastrophic thing you might want to do is you've painted this gorgeous piece and then you rip into it by accident when you're trying to remove it from the block. Just something to keep in mind. All right, let's get on to my final thoughts. And this is where it gets good, so don't leave me yet. Okay, and while I have you, has this been helpful? I know paper is such a big question, so head into comments. Let me know if you've had your own thoughts about this comparison from your own experience, what your results were. Let's get the conversation party started. And of course, while you're at it, if you're enjoying this type of content, these comparisons, or you're just having fun on my channel in general, I would love for you to give this video a boop, friends. That's a like, and it really helps me out, and I am so grateful. I'm laying down the first layers of paint on both papers, and I'm being pretty heavy-handed with it. I'm using a fair amount of pressure. I just kind of want to push both papers to their limit. So is this exactly how I would approach a real painting? No, but when I do these tests, any type of supplies, I like to think about some of the hang-ups that often happen as a beginner and kind of replicate those type of scenarios. Doing a lot of lifting, a lot of pushing the color around, a lot of adding dark colors early on in the painting, which is actually something I do, but in this scenario, I'm doing it in a different way to kind of like force the muddy issue. I want to see how each paper handles it. But in terms of first layers, both of these papers handle beautifully. The color goes on cleanly, it explodes, it moves the way I would expect it to. The Arches definitely dries slower, which is actually what you want for watercolor, so you have more time to like zhuzh and play. But first layers, juicy, wet on wet, even wet on dry, all the things that are happening are exactly what I would expect, and the results are pleasant, satisfying, and enjoyable. Now I'm gonna let both of these dry and see how the second layer does. Will the second layer glaze well? Will it maintain clarity? Will I be able to get that glow? Or will the surface of the paper kind of dull? That's what I'm gonna be looking for. Let's take a look at pricing here, and the difference is pretty wide. I compared blocks of Arches cold press to Legion cold press, both 140 pound. The size was 9 by 12 sheets. Currently, when this video was made on Amazon, a 9 by 12 sheet of Stonehenge was $1.46. And the same in Arches was $2.25. That's almost an 80-cent difference per sheet, and that can add up really quick. So the price difference is pretty substantial. Okay, final thoughts. Arches. Whatever. While definitely more expensive, it is by far the better paper if you want to glaze, create lots of layers, or if you're doing mixed media, or think you might be potentially correcting a lot of beginner mistakes, and I use that word very lightly. It's just holding up better and allowing the clarity of the watercolor layers to shine through, even when the technique may not be top shelf. In a nutshell, this paper is extremely forgiving, but Arches also requires more knowledge of water control as it holds so much water in the surface of the paper. Stonehenge shines with one layer loose watercolor techniques and could prove to be a spectacular solution for affordable paper you're not afraid to practice with. Stonehenge is definitely softer in texture and doesn't keep the integrity of previous layers of color as you add additional layers of color. I even let those experiment leaf paintings dry over 12 hours to ensure my testing and my evaluation was sound. And still, Stonehenge didn't want to glaze well. So do I believe that Arches is worth the price? Absolutely 100%. You just have to look at what your budget can handle. Something to keep in mind, painting on the back side of Stonehenge, not so easy. When you pull that sheet off the block of Stonehenge and you hold it up to the light, you can see what you did on the other side pretty clearly. So if you're curious about Arches and you want to kind of bask in all of the amazing benefits of it but are afraid of the price, keep the whole double-sided thing in mind. Now, I will never stop using Stonehenge. It's fantastic for practice. It's fantastic for paintings where I'm doing line and wash and I'm not doing lots of layers. It's beautiful quality. It just has some limitations, depending on your style of artwork. Now, you might not be ready for this level of paper in terms of budget, and honestly, I get it because it's a lot. So take a look at this video next where I review a bunch of different budget watercolor papers and I choose my favorite. And until next time, no matter what paper you're using, I wish you tons of happy painting.